Welcome again to the Global Leadership Podcast. This is part of the series on countering the disempowerment and demoralization we have seen around the globe. And today's focus is on self-esteem and looking at the impact of humiliation rituals.
All right, let's dive into a new way of thinking for today's complex, post-colonial world. We have to start here. Information isn't just neutral anymore. It's actively weaponized. So the core problem is what's called linear mind control. What is that exactly? Think of it like a mental loop. It's fear-based, repetitive, and easily manipulated by outside forces. When you're stuck in that loop, you're just projecting old biases onto new global realities. Okay, check out this contrast. It lays out two completely different ways of operating. So what's the way out? Well, the solution offered is called the repeatless mind. The key here isn't to block information out, but to transform it into actual awareness. And here's how you start. It's about actively noticing your patterns and then interrupting them. Doing this consistently builds a totally new kind of critical awareness. It's framed as a complete evolutionary leap in how we perceive the world. So why does this matter globally? It's a tool for your freedom from control narratives. You can actually use manipulative info as fuel for your own awareness, instead of being divided. So, the final question is this. In a world of weaponized narratives, whose tools are you thinking with?
Hello and welcome. Today, we're diving straight into the heart of a world that feels like it's in constant motion, doesn't it? We're going to explore a really compelling argument about our shifting global order and then contrast it with the unique psychology of a generation that was literally forged by that same instability. The whole point here is to give you the tools for critical thinking so you can look beyond the daily headlines and start to understand the much deeper forces at play.
And that brings us to the big question, really. Are we living through the end of an era? To get at that, we're going to deconstruct two very different, yet surprisingly connected source materials to try and make sense of the monumental crossroads we seem to be facing. Now, let's be clear from the start. This explainer isn't about handing you all the answers on a plate. Instead, it's about asking the right questions. It's about giving you the frameworks to think for yourself as we break down these two powerful, and you'll see, often competing narratives about our world.
Okay, let's dive into our first perspective. The core argument here is that the historical timeline as we've known it hasn't just been nudged, it's been fundamentally broken, marking a really definitive shift from the past.
So, according to our first source, to really get a grip on what's happening globally, you first have to understand this concept it calls the colonized mind. This basically describes a mindset that's been shaped by historical power dynamics. So when a new crisis hits, the reaction isn't based on fresh analysis, but on these old ingrained patterns of fear and looking back to the old established authorities.
Right, so the central claim of this worldview is that the Western-led global order isn't just being challenged from the outside, it's actually crumbling from within. And according to this source, the signs are absolutely everywhere.
This question, wow. It's from Burkina Faso's young leader Ibrahim Traoré, and it's presented as this perfect example of a new, incredibly assertive leadership emerging in Africa. It's what you might call a first principles question. It just cuts through centuries of complex rhetoric to challenge the very foundation of the old order. Okay, and this is where the source really starts to weave a compelling narrative. It connects what look like totally separate events. You've got political defiance in Africa, mysterious military failures, even assassination attempts, and it presents them all as interconnected symptoms of one single, much larger story. A system that is fundamentally losing control.
So if the old system is faltering, what's rising up to take its place? The source argues that a new power isn't just on the horizon. It's already here, and it's making some very decisive moves on the world stage.
And this slide, well, it really brings the argument down to earth, doesn't it? We're moving beyond just talk and rhetoric into the actual nuts and bolts, the infrastructure of global power. The fact that there's now a Chinese alternative to the SWIFT and MasterCard systems is presented as a direct, structural challenge to Western financial dominance. Now, the source is really clear on this. These aren't just random policy choices. They're presented as calculated strategic moves from a power that is very consciously reclaiming its historical position in the world, and it's all driven by a deep, deep sense of historical memory.
Okay, so we've looked at this huge macro view of a shifting world order. But what about the people actually living through it all? To get the full picture, we need to make a pivot, away from geopolitics and into psychology. Our second source asks us to look at the mindset of a specific generation forged right in the heart of this system of decay, Generation X. 7 million. By 1984, that was roughly the number of unsupervised children, so-called latchkey kids, in the United States alone. Think about that. An entire generation came home from school to an empty house, learning a very unique kind of independence from a very, very young age.
So what does that create? The source calls it a high-contingency environment, which is a bit of a mouthful, I know. But what it really means is a space where your brain gets hardwired for a simple, almost brutal reality: action and reaction, cause and effect. There was no parent there to talk you out of a mistake or soften the blow.
And this process, this feedback loop, it's pretty harsh but incredibly effective. You're alone, you mess up, you face the consequences right then and there. And what do you learn? You learn to rely on yourself, radically so. You learn to solve your own problems and to think 3 steps ahead, constantly calculating risk. And it wasn't just being home alone. This generation was told, just follow the rules, work hard, you'll be fine. But the rules kept changing right in front of their eyes. Institution after institution, promise after promise, just seemed to crumble. This repeated trauma created what psychologists now call defensive pessimism. You hope for the best, but you always expect the worst.
So, it's easy to look at this and just call it cynicism. But the source argues it's something much deeper than that. It's a highly adapted survival mechanism. It's a pragmatic, almost weary worldview that was forged in the fire of repeated institutional failure.
All right. So we have our two narratives. On one hand, you've got this epic story of a collapsing global order. And on the other, the psychology of a generation that's been conditioned to expect collapse. What happens when we put them side by side?
And this, right here, is the central tension we are exploring. This is the collision. What happens when this world-changing story meets a mindset that instinctively trusts no story, especially not one that's being told by an authority figure? And the contrast here is just fascinating, isn't it? The colonized mind is described as reacting with hysteria, looking back to an old dependent past. Meanwhile, the Gen X mind reacts with that defensive pessimism, rooted in an individualistic past where, really, the only person you could ever truly rely on was yourself.
And this brings us to this incredible paradox. Is it possible that what one worldview sees as a dangerous blindness to collapse, another sees as, well, simple realism? A mindset that has basically been waiting for the other shoe to drop its entire life.
So how do we navigate all of this? Our first source actually offers a potential guiding principle, a tool. You shall know them by their deeds, not their rhetoric. It's a really powerful call to cut through all the noise, to cut through the competing stories, and ground our understanding in things we can actually see and observe.
And that really is the challenge this explainer leaves you with. In a world of competing realities, maybe the most important question isn't what to believe, but how to think. How do we, each of us, build that capacity for clear-eyed analysis in a world that is, by all accounts, in a profound and fascinating state of flux?